You may have heard of the term Titer test. You might be wondering, what is a Titer test? What are they for? And do I need one for my dog? We're going to explore what that is today and give a little bit of understanding and clarity to Titer tests, how they can be best used, and what they really tell us.
Mm-hmm. So a Titer, T-I-T-E-R, not teeter or titter. It's like the word nobody knows how to pronounce. Titer is effectively an antibody level. So a Titer test tells you that your dog has this many antibodies against a certain virus or bacteria. There are only some titers that are really available to run, so you cannot do a titer for like every disease you might think of that your dog might get, and some of those are not worth doing anyway. So the typical titer tests that might be available are going to be distemper, parvovirus, and rabies. And those are typically the ones that people are looking at when they're thinking, is this something I need? Is this something I want? Mm-hmm. So again, basically it is supposed to reflect the number of antibodies that your dog has currently in its bloodstream against one of those three diseases typically.
And this is what is kind of how people refer to as you're measuring immunity, which that's correct to a degree, but not completely. And we'll get to that here in just a few minutes. But when you see, when you perform a Titer test on your dog and you see that they have, a certain number behind, the rabies titer, that shows you that that's their level of antibodies in their system. So they have antibodies to rabies, therefore they would be considered immune to rabies. So that's kind of what Titer tests kind of are looked at as.
Yeah, it's meant to be a reflection of immunity.
Yes.
Now, some people come out and they say, but just because you have these many antibodies doesn't mean that they would be effective antibodies or the right antibodies for the situation. And so there can be some discussion there, but that is technically, that's what they're supposed to mean.
Mm-hmm. So let's say you are a pet parent and you want to ensure that you're not going to over-vaccinate your puppy. And so you're like, okay, I'm going to do my immunizations and then I want to do a Titer test to show immunity so that I don't keep doing unnecessary boosters. So Dr. Levy, what would be the recommended timing of doing a Titer test, let's say for a puppy, for example?
Right, and so the issue with doing a Titer test before the puppy is really about 5 months old or 6 months old. The problem of doing the Titer test before then is that you don't know if you're measuring maternal antibodies or the puppy's own antibodies. Mm-hmm. And so you would say, well, by that time my puppy would have finished the series of vaccines anyway. Yes, that is true. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it is a bit of a challenge. There are different ways of doing Titer tests, and so there are a couple of in-house tests that your vet may or may not have on their shelf. One is called Titer check, one is called VaxiCheck, and what that means is that if you request a Titer, this is something that the technician would be running in your vet clinic's own laboratory area. There are Titer tests that are done by like the big laboratory companies like IDEXX and Antech, so you can have your vet send in a blood sample to those companies and they will come back with numbers. I typically have my clients run their Titer test through HemoPet. Mm-hmm. Very specifically, the reason I do that is because if you run the Titer test through the regular laboratories, they have a number and they say, well, if there's only this many antibodies or fewer, we're gonna call it negative. Mm-hmm. And that I think is misleading because really you could say, well, how many antibodies do there have to be in order for my dog to be protected? Mm-hmm. Well, because there's a whole other part of our immune system that we can't test. And we have these B memory cells in our lymph nodes that remember everything that we are immune to. Technically, where there is one antibody, there could be tens of thousands in fractions of a second. Mm-hmm. If the need arises, if your already immunized body meets that antigen, that disease, literally within fractions of a second, your body, there could be this huge outpouring of antibodies and you would be protected. You don't necessarily have circulating antibodies in your bloodstream all the time. So I'm interested in knowing, are there any antibodies at all? Not, are there this many or are there only this many? So Hemopet typically runs what's called an endpoint on their titers, which means you will just get the number and you decide if that's a number that you like to see or not.
So what's great about Hemopet is that you can go to any veterinary office with a lab, have blood drawn and spun down, and you can actually send it in yourself. It's relatively inexpensive, and depending on what your needs are, you really only need to maybe do it once. It's not something that you would necessarily repeatedly do. And so just to kind of go back to what Dr. Levy was saying, it's very important to realize that even if your animal showed immunity or a titer to distemper, for example, at one point, and then you retiter them 3 years later and they don't show any antibodies to distemper, that does not necessarily mean that they do not have immunity to distemper. What that means is that they did not encounter distemper recently enough for there to be antibodies present. I actually had that happen with one of my girls. I did homeoprophylaxis as her immunization when she was a puppy, titered her when she was 8 months old. She titered for parvo, she titered for distemper, never gave her a shot, but that was my choice. I just immunized her differently, which told me, okay, she produced immunity to this. We titered her again when she was 5 because we had a Niederreise where we needed to spay her, and she did not show any titer for distemper. Well, guess what? I didn't freak out because I know that at one time her body did have an immune response to distemper. So if she were to encounter distemper at an older age without antibodies present, her memory cells in her lymph nodes are going to go to work and they're going to produce antibodies that fast because there's memory cells in there that say, oh, distemper, I know exactly what this is. Now I'm going to send out what I need. But they didn't need to be there before because distemper wasn't there. There wasn't a threat. So that just gives you a little bit of an example on kind of, yes, we like to see numbers on titer tests, but they're not the end all be all either.
And I have seen some vets say like, oh, once you have a measurable titer, the titer will never change. And we know that that's not true.
That's not true.
I have a couple of other clients who really just out of curiosity, titer their dogs in the spring. There was no evidence of immunity to distemper. And then after a heavy summer, in the show ring, titered those dogs again, high antibodies against distemper. Because they're encountering the virus when they're coming into contact with dogs who have been recently vaccinated and are shedding the virus into the environment. It's not like they're not coming into contact with other dogs that have distemper, but the vaccine virus will stimulate immunity as well.
So if you do want to do titers on your puppy, just know that you should wait till they're at least 6 months old. Then you're well out of the range of where there could still be maternal antibodies present so that you are measuring their immune response, their antibody production, and not their mom's. That typically can be in place till they're 15, 16, 17 weeks old. Sometimes they can have maternal antibodies. So you just want to make sure that you have, kind of gone past that window so that you're actually getting an accurate measure if you're looking to do a titer. Then the next question that people might be asking is, well, what if my dog's not a puppy? How often should I titer? Because I don't want to over-vaccinate my adult dog either. And so that's a great question, is what do you do when your dog is older? When and why would you want or need a titer?
Yeah, and so technically for the most part, because we understand how vaccines work, we understand how the immunity works. And so if your dog is going out and about in the world, they will periodically come into contact with these viruses. And the fact that they don't get sick kind of shows you that they're immune. However, once in a while, people run into, I love my groomer, but they won't let me come back without proof of vaccination. I love my boarding kennel, but they won't let me come back without proof of vaccination. And in my mind, that's kind of what titers are for, to appease somebody so that they will let you come back in. Now, sometimes people come in and they say, well, I want to do titers because my groomer's requiring vaccines. You need to ask them if they will accept titers because, I read medical records all day, every day, and I see even veterinarians saying, oh, well, just because your dog has a measurable titer doesn't mean that they're immune. And some people don't believe in titers or titer test results. And so you would need to have a talk to them, or like an apartment complex. You would need to have a conversation with them to see kind of where they're at and to see if that's going to be okay with them. I would probably not just assume. The only place where I would assume is if you license your dog in the city where you live, they are probably not going to be interested enough whether you bring in proof of rabies vaccination or whether you bring in titer test results.
There's a sheet of proof is a sheet of proof.
They're
for
not
them.
really there to have a philosophical discussion with you about vaccines versus titer testing. So there, I would just do it as a fait accompli. Just go in, just a piece of paper, here's my money, or however you submit it online. I don't think you're going to get any pushback.
So really, the only reason that somebody would need to do a titer test is if maybe it's for peace of mind. Maybe you want to know at least one time, okay, there's antibodies present when they're a young puppy. Now I feel comfortable, I'm good. We've kind of checked that off the list. Otherwise, you might have certain situations where you want to bring your dog somewhere and they will accept a titer test in lieu of proof of vaccination. But other than that, it's not this absolute swap where if you're not going to do boosters, you need to titer.
Right.
It's not necessary unless you actually have, a reason to where you would want to show that in lieu of proof of vaccination or for your own peace of mind. But again, just remember that, if they're a little bit older and they haven't encountered, distemper is not super common in our environment. And so they can have a titer from when they've been immunized as a puppy and then not run into distemper for 3 years. Their body's not going to keep producing antibodies. They're not running into distemper.
Right.
And so just kind of keep that in mind. Keep titer tests kind of in their place and understanding there's a whole other part of the immune system that you can't measure. That is absolutely functioning.
Right. The other thing that I see is that some veterinarians will tell people straight up, you should not do titer testing. It's so expensive. Just get the vaccine instead. Well, for one thing, that's not their decision to make. And potentially you could say, the titer test at least is harmless. It is a blood sample that I'm going to send to a lab, whereas the vaccine can have serious ramifications.
Right.
And if you want to see expense, you should see what some of my clients have paid at these referral centers and at the emergency hospital just because of one vaccine that by itself did not cost that much.
But the damage that it does is expensive to try and fix.
And so hopefully we've explained that and made it clearer in this video that even a negative titer test is not cause for alarm, and it does not indicate that your dog needs a booster. I have had occasions where people run into a situation where they need proof of rabies fast, like the dog bit the mailman and I'll have to vaccinate it if I don't have titer test results. There's a minimum 4-week turnaround time on the rabies titer test. They're run at Kansas State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, and there's not like, you can't just mark a box and say expedite for an extra 20, like no. And so that's something where you might just be in a bind because people are not going to wait 4 weeks for you to get a test done. And
Be proactive, I think, is the punchline there.
And I will say, like every other veterinarian, I was vaccinated against rabies. At this point, it was, 30-something years ago. I had my titer checked about 5 years after I graduated. I was at a conference and they were offering free titer tests for rabies. And I had a high titer at the time, and I'll never check it again. It's not necessary. I don't need to. I'll always be immune to rabies.
Yep, and we've referenced him before, but we'll do it again. Dr. Ronald Schultz did amazing work when he was still with us. He was an expert in immunology for 40 years at the University of Wisconsin. He was on the board that really kind of was in charge of veterinary protocol for vaccine. He was a very, very smart man, and he did a lot of great research and showed proof of immunity from one well-timed shot for 7 years until the money ran out for the studies, and then they didn't do any more. Right. So we'll link his information down below. He did some great work as well. So it's pretty simple. Just kind of understand and know the way that your dog's immune system works.
Yeah.
And respect the system that is in place and just choose wisely based on all of these different factors.